The storm had swallowed the road an hour before Charles Pendleton, 7th Duke of Westford, admitted defeat and ordered his coachman to press on regardless. Snow did not fall so much as it hurled itself sideways across the Yorkshire moor, and the carriage lamps threw only a thin, trembling circle of light against a world gone entirely white. He had not wanted to make this journey in December. His steward had begged him to wait until the roads cleared, until the worst of the season passed, until a man of 31 with a duchy to steward and a season's worth of unfinished business in London could afford the delay. But Charles had not waited. He never waited anymore. Waiting had cost him too much once, and he had trained himself, in the 14 months since, never to sit still long enough to feel the weight of what he'd lost. He told himself he was inspecting the northern tenant farms before the deep frost set in. He told himself the tenants needed him. He did not tell himself the truth, which was that Marlow Park, his family seat 2 counties south, had become unbearable to him in winter, because it was in winter, on a night very like this one, that Harley Ashworth had vanished from his life 3 days before their wedding, leaving behind nothing but an unsigned letter and a silence that had never once, in 14 months, given him an answer he could live with. "Your Grace," the coachman's voice came muffled through the small window, barely audible over the wind. "There's something in the road." Charles leaned forward. Through the frosted glass, he could make out only a low shape, dark against the snow, perhaps 30 yards ahead, where the lane curved beside a stand of bare elms. "Stop the carriage. Your Grace, in this weather. Stop it." The wheels ground to a halt. Charles was out of the carriage before the footman could open the door for him, his boots sinking to the ankle in fresh powder, the wind driving needles of ice into his face. He crossed the distance at a near run, some instinct older than reason, telling him this was not a fallen branch, not a dead sheep, not any of the ordinary hazards a winter road might offer. It was a woman. She lay curled on her side in the lee of a stone wall, as though she had crawled there seeking whatever shelter the wall might give, and found none. Snow had drifted against her back and settled in the folds of the coat she wore, a heavy military greatcoat, far too large for her frame, the collar turned up against a face gone the color of the snow itself. Her lips had a bluish cast that made Charles's chest constrict with a fear he did not examine too closely. He dropped to his knees beside her, tearing off his own glove to press 2 fingers to her throat, a pulse, faint, sluggish, but there. "Fetch blankets," he shouted back toward the carriage, "and brandy, and tell Dr. Finch's man we'll need him the moment we reach the inn." It was only as he gathered her into his arms, meaning to carry her the last stretch to the carriage, that he registered the coat properly, not merely its size or its warmth, but its cut, its buttons, the particular wear at the left elbow, where a man had once rested his arm against a saddle for the better part of a decade. He knew this coat. He had worn this coat through 2 winters of war in the peninsula, had draped it over a woman's shoulders on a night much like this one, on the terrace at Marlow Park, and told her that as long as she wore it, she would never again be cold, because he intended to spend the rest of his life making certain of it. He pulled back the sodden hood, and the wind and the snow and the whole white waste of the moor seemed to fall utterly silent around him. Harley. Her eyes were closed, her lashes crusted with frost, but he would have known her anywhere, in any state, after any span of years. The woman who had promised to marry him. The woman who had disappeared 3 days before the wedding without a word of explanation, and whom he had spent 14 months trying, and failing, to hate. And then, against his chest, muffled beneath the coat's heavy wool, he heard it. A thin, exhausted cry. Not the wind, not his imagination playing him false in the cold and the dark. A child. He tore the coat further open with hands that had gone suddenly clumsy, and there, bound against Harley's body in a sling of what looked like torn petticoat, was an infant no more than a few months old, its small face pinched with cold, its cry weakening, even as he uncovered it to the freezing air. Charles Pendleton, who had not allowed himself to feel much of anything in 14 months beyond a controlled and private grief, felt the whole architecture of his composure crack straight through. "Blankets!" he roared again, and this time his voice cracked on the word. "Now. For God's sake, now." The inn at Thornby Cross was a modest establishment, 3 rooms and a tap room, and a landlady named Mrs. Kestel, who took one look at the Duke of Westford, carrying a half-frozen woman and infant through her door in the middle of a blizzard, and did not waste a single moment on ceremony. Within the quarter hour there was a fire built high in the best room, warmed bricks wrapped in flannel and tucked at Harley's feet, and a wet nurse sent for from the neighboring farm, a young mother named Susan Trent, who arrived breathless and wide-eyed, and asked no questions Charles was not prepared to answer. Dr. Finch's man, a sensible fellow called Pruitt, who traveled the northern circuit and had seen every manner of winter injury a hard county could produce, examined Harley by candlelight, while Charles paced the narrow hallway outside, unable to make himself sit. "She'll live, Your Grace," Pruitt said, when he finally emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Barely, but she'll live. Exposure, exhaustion, and she's not eaten properly in some days by the look of her. The child is stronger than I'd have credited, though he's suffered for the cold as she has. Whoever kept that coat wrapped around them both saved both their lives. Another hour in that wind, and I don't believe I'd be telling you either story." Charles said nothing. He was looking past the doctor's shoulder into the room, where Harley lay pale and still against the pillows, her dark hair loose and matted, looking so unlike the composed, quick-witted young woman who had once argued philosophy with him over his mother's dinner table, that for a moment he doubted his own eyes all over again. "Is she your wife, Your Grace?" Pruitt asked, not unkindly, simply trying to understand what manner of household he had walked into. "No," Charles said. Then, because the doctor deserved something nearer the truth, she was meant to be. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair beside the bed while the fire burned down and built itself up again under Mrs. Kestel's attentions, and he watched Harley Ashworth breathe, and he turned over in his mind, again and again, every version of the woman he thought he had known. She had been 19 when they met, at his cousin's wedding breakfast, seated 3 places down the table and arguing with unusual conviction that Mrs. Wollstonecraft had been entirely correct and entirely underappreciated, to the visible discomfort of an elderly baron's wife. Charles, 26 at the time, and already weary of the vapid conversation that generally attended such gatherings, had found himself listening rather more closely than propriety strictly required. She was the daughter of a baronet of modest means and considerable debts, which made her, in the calculus of the ton, a perfectly respectable but wholly unremarkable match, the sort of young woman a duke might dance with twice at a ball without anyone remarking upon it, and certainly not the sort a duke was expected to fall in love with. Charles had fallen in love with her regardless, slowly, over the course of 2 seasons, in libraries and gardens and the margins of formal events, where they contrived, with increasing shamelessness, to find themselves alone together for 5 minutes at a time. He remembered, with a clarity that startled him even now, the particular afternoon he had understood himself entirely lost. It had been at a modest garden party at his cousin's country house, the kind of gathering considered too unfashionable for the great hostesses of London to trouble themselves with, and Harley had been seated beneath a chestnut tree with a volume of poetry she had not, in fact, been reading, watching instead a pair of swallows building a nest beneath the eaves of the old stable. Charles had approached meaning only to pay the ordinary courtesies, and had instead found himself sitting beside her for the better part of an hour, discussing nothing of consequence: the swallows, the likelihood of rain, a disputed point of Latin grammar neither of them had studied with any particular rigor, and discovering, somewhere in the unremarkable ordinariness of it, that he did not wish the hour to end. Their courtship, when it came, unfolded with none of the urgency society generally expected of a duke in want of a wife. There were evenings in the library at Marlow Park when his mother, still living then, had permitted them a chaperoned half-hour to discuss books neither of their families would have thought suitable reading for an unmarried young woman. There were mornings on horseback along the eastern boundary, Harley proving herself a considerably more capable rider than the fashionable young ladies of his acquaintance, laughing at him openly when he expressed surprise at it. There was a particular evening at a subscription ball in York when he had claimed her for 2 dances in defiance of every rule of propriety regarding a gentleman's attentions to an unmarried lady, and had not cared in the least what was whispered of it afterward, because she had looked at him, across the space of the second dance, with an expression that told him she felt precisely as reckless as he did. He had proposed to her in the rose garden at Marlow Park in the autumn, on an evening when the last of the season's blooms hung heavy and fragrant in the cooling air, kneeling in the damp grass in a manner his valet had later declared an unforgivable ruin to a perfectly good pair of breeches, and she had said yes with tears standing in her eyes, and for 4 months Charles Pendleton had been, by his own private reckoning, the happiest man in England. Then, 3 days before the wedding, she was gone. No scene, no confrontation, only a letter, unsigned, in her own hand, that said she was sorry, that she could not marry him, that he must forget her entirely, and never attempt to learn more. Her father, when Charles rode to Ashworth Hall in a fury of confusion and grief, had seemed almost as bewildered as he was, and within a fortnight the old baronet himself had died of what the physicians called a seizure of the heart, but which Charles had always privately believed was simple heartbreak at his daughter's disappearance. Harley had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened beneath her. No family would claim to have seen her. No servant would admit to knowing where she had gone. Society, ever hungry for scandal, had settled with unkind speed on the theory that she had run off with some lover, some cad, who had turned her head and her ruin, and Charles, furious, humiliated, and grieving in equal measure, had let that story stand rather than continue asking questions that yielded nothing but fresh wounds. He had not thought of her as innocent in 14 months. He had thought of her as a woman who ran, who chose flight over honesty, who had let him stand at that altar in his imagination and burn with a shame he had not deserved. And now here she lay, half frozen, half starved, wrapped in his own coat with an infant at her breast, and Charles found that every certainty he had built his grief upon in 14 months of careful, controlled anger was dissolving faster than the snow outside the window. Near dawn, her eyes opened. For a long moment she only stared at the ceiling, disoriented, and then her gaze found him in the chair beside the bed, and something in her face went perfectly, terribly still. "Charles," she whispered, as though testing whether the word itself might be dangerous. How did you?" "You were in the road," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "In the snow, wearing my coat." Her hand moved instinctively toward her chest, toward where the child had been, and panic flooded her features. "My son, where is my—" "He's here. He's warm. He's being fed." Charles gestured toward the small cradle Mrs. Kestel's husband had improvised from a dresser drawer, where the infant slept, finally, peacefully, near the fire. "He's alive, Harley. You kept him alive." She turned her face away, toward the wall, and Charles watched her shoulders shake with silent, exhausted weeping, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the depths of a long night, that whatever story he had told himself for 14 months was not the whole of the truth. Perhaps it was not even the smallest part of it. "I am not going anywhere," he said quietly, "until you tell me everything." "You do not want to know everything," she whispered, still facing the wall. "No one would want to know everything. Try me." She said nothing more that night, but she did not ask him to leave the room either, and Charles took that, in the grey light of a Yorkshire dawn, as the very smallest of beginnings. It was 3 days before Harley was strong enough to sit upright and take a full meal without her hands shaking around the spoon, and in those 3 days Charles Pendleton did not leave Thornby Cross. He sent word to his steward that his return to Marlow Park would be delayed. He sent no word at all to the handful of society correspondents who would, had they known the Duke of Westford was closeted at a country inn with his vanished former fiancée and an infant of uncertain parentage, have manufactured a scandal vivid enough to occupy the drawing rooms of London for the better part of a season. He did not care. He found, rather to his own surprise, that he had stopped caring what London thought sometime around the moment he had pulled back that frost-crusted hood and recognized her face. On the third evening, with the child asleep in his makeshift cradle and Mrs. Kestel's fire burning low and steady, Harley finally spoke. "His name is Edmund," she said, without preamble, watching the flames rather than Charles. "I named him for my father. I thought if he could not know his grandfather, he might at least carry the name." "He's a fine boy," Charles said, and meant it, though he was careful to keep his voice even, unwilling to press her before she was ready. "You want to know if he is yours?" It was not a question he had permitted himself to ask aloud, though it had lived beneath every thought he'd had in 3 days, like a stone beneath still water. "I had assumed," he said carefully, given the timing, that he could not be. "He is not," she said it plainly, without flinching, though he saw her hands tighten in her lap. "I owe you the truth of that, much before I owe you anything else. Edmund is not your son, Charles. I would never have let you believe otherwise." Charles found that the confirmation, though he had braced for it, still struck something in his chest with unexpected force. He said nothing, only waited, and after a long moment, Harley drew a breath, as though gathering herself to walk into a fire. "Do you remember Mr. Silas Radnor?" The name meant nothing to Charles at first, and then, slowly, an unpleasant recollection surfaced. A man his own solicitor had once mentioned in passing, a moneylender of unsavory reputation, who had extended credit to a number of struggling families among the lesser gentry, credit that came with terms far crueler than any bank would have offered. "The moneylender. I recall the name. What of him?" "My father owed him a great deal of money," Harley said, "more than I ever knew, until after you and I were engaged. Papa had borrowed against Ashworth Hall itself to cover debts from bad investments, shipping ventures that failed, mostly, though I never learned the whole of it, and Radnor held notes that would have seen us turned out of our home within the year, engagement or no engagement. Your father never came to me." Charles heard the old anger in his own voice, 14 months stale but not diminished. "I would have settled the debt in an afternoon. You knew that. You must have known that." "I did know it," Harley said, and for the first time she looked at him directly. "And so did Radnor. That was precisely his difficulty, and precisely his opportunity." She told the rest of it slowly, in the flat, careful voice of someone reciting a wound so old and so deep that ordinary emotion could no longer touch its center. Radnor, learning of the impending marriage between the Ashworth heiress and the Duke of Westford, had understood at once that his considerable leverage over the family would evaporate the moment Charles Pendleton's fortune stood behind them. A duke's solicitors would crush a man like Radnor in a fortnight, and Radnor, whatever his failings, was not a stupid man. So he had come to Harley directly, 3 weeks before the wedding, with a proposition dressed as a threat and a threat dressed as a proposition. She would break the engagement, disappear from Charles's life entirely and permanently, and in exchange, Radnor would forgive her father's debts and ensure the old baronet lived out his remaining years undisturbed. If she refused, if she married her duke and thought her new position would shield her family, Radnor promised, in terms Harley described to Charles with a steadiness that cost her visibly, that he had men in his employ who would see to it that the Duke of Westford met with an unfortunate accident before the wedding could take place, and that her father would be ruined and imprisoned for debt regardless. "I did not believe, at first, that he could truly reach you," Harley said. "You were a duke. You had guards, position, protection. I could not imagine any man circumventing, but he showed me things, letters, a schedule of your movements he had no earthly reason to possess unless his men had been watching you for weeks. He knew your habit of riding alone at dawn along the eastern boundary of Marlow Park. He knew the names of your grooms. He knew things a moneylender's clerk should never have known, and I understood, finally, that I was not dealing with a man who made idle threats." Charles sat very still, the old fury from 14 months finding, at last, a proper target, and discovering it had nowhere left to go, because the man who deserved it was not in this room, and perhaps not even findable any longer. "So you left," he said quietly. "So I left." Her voice broke, just slightly, on the last word. "I wrote you that letter in an hour, because if I had taken longer, I would have lost my courage entirely and gone to you instead, and then Radnor's men would have done whatever they intended to do, and it would have been my fault, my choice, that killed you. I could not carry that. I would rather you hate me forever than bury you." "And the child," Charles said, though everything in him already dreaded the answer forming. Harley's composure, held so carefully through the whole of her account, finally gave way. "Radnor did not simply let me disappear into obscurity, Charles. He kept me, not as a wife. He had no interest in marriage, but as a kind of possession, a woman whose silence he had purchased and intended to keep purchased for as long as it suited him. I was moved between 3 different houses in 18 months, watched always, permitted to write to no one. Edmund is his son, not born of anything I would ever call love, born of a debt I paid with the only currency Radnor found valuable enough to accept." The fire popped and settled in the grate. Charles found he could not speak for a long moment, his jaw working against a fury so total it frightened him with its intensity, not at Harley, never, not for one instant, at Harley, but at a dead debt and a living monster and a world that had allowed a woman like her to be treated as currency at all. "How did you escape him?" he finally asked. "He grew careless," Harley said. "Or perhaps he simply grew bored of a woman who gave him no more use than her silence. Once Edmund was born, and I was no longer of interest to him in any other capacity. 3 weeks ago, at the house in Carlisle where he'd last kept me, I found a night when the man set to watch the doors had drunk himself past usefulness, and I took Edmund and what little I could carry and I ran, and I have been running ever since, sleeping in barns and church porches, walking when I could find no coach willing to carry a woman with no money and an infant, and no proper explanation for either. I do not know if Radnor's men are still searching for me. I have assumed they are. I was trying to reach my aunt in Northumberland. She is the only family I have left who might take me in without asking questions I cannot answer, when the storm caught us on the moor, and I do not remember much after that beyond the cold and the fear that I would not be able to keep Edmund warm enough. And then," she stopped. "And then you were there." "I was there," Charles said, and found his voice had gone unsteady in a way he had not permitted it to be in 14 months, in front of anyone. "You kept that coat all this time." "It was the only thing of yours I was permitted to keep," Harley said. Radnor thought it beneath his notice, an old greatcoat, worth nothing to a man of his tastes. I told myself every single night these 18 months that as long as I still had it, some part of the life I'd lost had not entirely vanished. Tonight, it saved both our lives. I think perhaps it has been saving my life in smaller ways every night since I left you." Charles rose from his chair and crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, so that his eyes were level with hers, and for the first time in 14 months, he allowed himself to reach out and take her hand. "You did not betray me," he said, and his voice, when it came, was rough with a grief and a fury and a tenderness that had all been buried alive together for over a year and were only now, together, clawing their way back into the daylight. "You saved me. Every single day of the misery you have described, you were saving my life at the cost of your own, and I spent 14 months hating you for it because I did not know any better." "You must not say such things to me," Harley whispered, though she did not pull her hand away. "I am not, Charles, I am not the woman you were meant to marry any longer. I have a child born of a man who held me as a possession. Society will never receive me, and rightly so. Whatever you feel in this room, tonight, moved by pity and by cold and by the shock of finding me at all, it cannot survive daylight. It cannot survive London. I will not let you ruin yourself trying to prove otherwise." "That," said Charles, with the particular quiet authority of a man who has just discovered exactly what he intends to do with the whole of his considerable power and influence, "is a decision you do not have the authority to make for me." It took another full week before Dr. Finch himself, summoned from the larger town of Ripon, pronounced Harley fit enough to travel, and by then Charles had already dispatched 3 separate letters by private courier, one to his London solicitor, instructing an immediate and thorough investigation into the whereabouts and financial affairs of one Silas Radnor, one to his estate steward at Marlow Park, instructing the immediate preparation of the East Wing guest apartments, the ones with the good morning light and the private garden entrance, and one, considerably more delicate in its wording, to his widowed aunt Lady Cassandra Pendleton, a woman whose sharp tongue and sharper social instincts had steered more than one Pendleton through scandal in her 61 years, asking her to meet them at Marlow Park upon their return, on a matter he described only as of the utmost delicacy and the utmost importance. Harley protested the whole of the arrangement with a stubbornness Charles found he had entirely forgotten she possessed, buried as it had been beneath 14 months of grief and 18 of captivity. "You cannot simply install me in your house, Charles. A duke does not bring home a woman with an infant born of a criminal's captivity and expect society to look the other way because he wills it so." "I am not asking society to look the other way," Charles said, handing her up into the carriage with a care that made his footmen exchange glances they were wise enough not to voice aloud. "I am asking society to look directly at the truth, once I have finished ensuring the truth cannot be denied or twisted by anyone with an interest in doing so. And if they will not accept it, if they see only a bastard child and a ruined woman and refuse every explanation you offer, then they may refuse to attend my house," Charles said, settling across from her as the carriage lurched into motion, Edmund asleep in a basket between them, "and I shall find that I am able to bear the loss of their company with remarkable equanimity." Harley looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind her eyes. "You have changed," she said quietly. "The man I knew would have cared, at least a little, what was said of him in the clubs." "The man you knew," Charles said, "believed the woman he loved had abandoned him for no better reason than her own convenience. I have had 14 months to discover precisely how wrong a man's certainties can be. I find I no longer trust the good opinion of anyone who forms a judgment before learning the whole of a story. That includes, I confess, my former self." The journey south took 4 days, the roads still treacherous with drifted snow in the higher country, before easing as they came down into the gentler landscape of the Midlands. Charles used the time as he had not permitted himself to use time in 14 months, not filling every hour with duty and correspondence, and the careful architecture of a life built to avoid feeling anything too deeply, but simply sitting with Harley, listening as she spoke, haltingly at first and then with increasing ease, of the 18 months she had endured. She told him of the 3 houses Radnor had kept her in, each one more isolated than the last. She told him of the other women she had glimpsed in his household, servants too frightened to speak to her, and of the particular loneliness of being watched constantly and spoken to almost never. She told him, on the 2nd night, of the night Edmund was born, alone but for a midwife Radnor had paid to be discreet, and of the strange, fierce love that had risen in her the moment she held her son, a love that had nothing to do with how he came to exist, and everything to do with the fact that he was hers to protect. "I thought, for a time, that I could not love him," she admitted, on the 3rd night, watching the sleeping infant with an expression Charles found he could not look away from. "I thought I would see only Radnor in his face and hate him for it. And then he was born, and he looked at me with such helpless trust, and I understood that whatever his father had done, Edmund himself had done nothing, and he needed me, and I found I could not withhold from him what every part of me wished to give." "He is fortunate in his mother," Charles said, and meant every word of it. For his own part, Charles told her, for the first time, of the 14 months she had missed, of the wedding that never happened, of the humiliation he had swallowed in silence rather than admit how deeply her disappearance had wounded him, of the slow hardening he had felt in himself, A duke who had once laughed easily and now rarely laughed at all, who had thrown himself into estate business and parliamentary committees and the endless grinding machinery of ducal responsibility because it was easier than sitting still with a grief he could not explain to anyone who asked. "I told everyone you had run off with a lover," he admitted, low, ashamed. "I let that story stand because the alternative, that you had simply changed your mind, that you had found me insufficient reason to stay, was somehow worse to me than believing you a woman of poor character. I am sorry for that, Harley. I am sorry I did not trust you enough to wonder if there might be another explanation." "You could not have known," Harley said. "I made certain of that. It was the entire design of my leaving that no one should be able to trace the truth back to Radnor, lest he make good on his threats regardless." "I could have looked harder," Charles said. "I chose not to, because looking harder meant hoping, and I did not think I could survive the hope if it came to nothing." They reached Marlow Park on a clear, cold afternoon in the second week of January, the great house rising pale and formidable against a sky scrubbed blue by the passing storm, and Harley, looking up at its familiar facade from the carriage window, felt something in her chest tighten with a complicated grief, for the wedding that should have taken place here, for the life she had once expected, for the woman she had been before Radnor, and the cold roads had remade her into someone harder and more frightened and, she hoped, not entirely beyond repair. "Welcome home," Charles said quietly, and offered her his hand to descend, and Harley, after a long moment, took it. Lady Cassandra Pendleton arrived at Marlow Park 2 days after Charles and Harley, having traveled with a speed that suggested she had taken his letter's mention of the utmost delicacy rather more literally than most correspondents would have dared. She was a tall woman, silver-haired and ramrod straight even at 61, with a reputation in society for a wit sharp enough to draw blood and a fierce, unfashionable loyalty to family that had, on more than one occasion, seen her face down duchesses twice her rank in defense of a Pendleton she judged unfairly wronged. She arrived, took one look at the household arrangements, Harley installed in the east wing, an infant's cradle newly delivered to the nursery, Charles hovering with an attentiveness his aunt had not observed in him since he was a boy recovering from scarlet fever, and demanded, without preamble, a private audience with her nephew before she would so much as remove her traveling cloak. "You have lost your mind," she informed Charles, the moment the drawing-room doors were closed. "I do not say this unkindly, Charles, but you must see how it appears. The woman who abandoned you at the altar returned after 14 months with another man's child, and you have installed her in the finest guest apartments in the house, as though nothing at all were amiss." "I would ask you to hear the whole account before you judge it," Charles said, and told her, carefully, factually, without the raw emotion that still colored his own private thinking on the matter, everything Harley had told him at Thornby Cross. Lady Cassandra listened without interruption, her sharp eyes never leaving her nephew's face, and when he had finished she was silent for a long moment, turning the account over with the same rigor she had once applied to disentangling a cousin's disastrous business partnership or negotiating a niece's difficult marriage settlement. "You believe her," she said finally. It was not quite a question. "I believe her entirely," Charles said. "My solicitor's inquiries into Radnor's affairs, though only 2 weeks underway, have already confirmed the man held notes against Ashworth Hall in the amount she described, and confirmed further that those notes were mysteriously forgiven the same week Harley disappeared. I do not believe in coincidence of that particular magnitude, Aunt." "And the child?" "Is an innocent," Charles said, "born into circumstances no infant chooses, and no infant should be made to answer for. I intend to raise him as my own son, in every particular that matters, whatever society may say of it." Lady Cassandra studied him for a long moment more. "You understand," she said, "what you are asking of yourself. Not merely society's censure, though there will be plenty of that. You are asking to raise another man's child, born of an arrangement no drawing-room in London will describe with any delicacy, as the heir presumptive of Westford, ahead of any legitimate son you might yet father. Edmund will not inherit the dukedom, Charles said. The entail does not permit it, and I would not attempt to circumvent the entail even if it did. That inheritance belongs to Pendleton blood, and Edmund is not of Pendleton blood, and I think he deserves to know his own history plainly, rather than have it obscured for the sake of a title. But he will inherit my name, my protection, my care, and every advantage a father's love can provide a son, whatever the accident of his birth. That much I will not negotiate, with you or with anyone else who thinks to raise the question." Something in Lady Cassandra's expression shifted, not quite softening, for she was not a woman given easily to softness, but settling into something that looked, on her severe features, remarkably like respect. "Your father," she said slowly, "would have hidden this entire affair, packed the woman off to some distant cottage with a modest allowance, and married a suitable heiress within the year to preserve the family's dignity." "I am aware of what my father would have done," Charles said. "I have spent 14 months being precisely the sort of duke my father would have approved of, dutiful, controlled, entirely governed by what the world expected of me. I find I am finished with it." Lady Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a small, sharp thing, but genuine. "Then you had better let me see her," she said, "before I decide whether to help you or simply watch you ruin yourself with considerable interest." The interview that followed, conducted over tea in Harley's private sitting room, with Edmund asleep in a bassinet by the window, lasted the better part of 2 hours, and Charles, who had offered to remain, was firmly instructed by his aunt to remove himself to the library and permit the women to speak without a nervous duke hovering at the door. He spent the 2 hours in a state of considerable agitation, unable to concentrate on the estate ledgers he pretended to review, listening for footsteps in the corridor and finding none until, at last, the sitting-room door opened and Lady Cassandra emerged alone, her expression unreadable. "Well?" Charles demanded, rising so quickly he nearly overturned the ledger entirely. "She is," Lady Cassandra said slowly, "considerably more intelligent than I expected, and considerably less inclined to indulge your dramatic instincts than you might wish. Do you know she spent the better part of an hour attempting to persuade me that you should be discouraged from any public claim upon her, on the grounds that your political standing matters more than her comfort?" "That sounds," Charles said, with some feeling, "exactly like her." "She loves you," Lady Cassandra said, without preamble, in the same tone she might have used to observe that it looked like rain, rather inconveniently, given the circumstances, but there it is. "And she is terrified, Charles, not of Radnor, though she has reason enough for that fear too, but of watching you sacrifice your position and your future on her account and coming, eventually, to resent her for it. She would rather disappear again than see that happen to you." Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. She would not. "She very nearly convinced me it was the wiser course," Lady Cassandra said dryly. "I am not entirely certain she is wrong, from a purely practical standpoint. But I did not raise nephews to be practical men when it mattered least, and I find I have very little patience remaining for practicality when a woman has walked through 18 months of captivity and a snowstorm to keep her son alive, rather than surrender either her life or his to a monster. She has more courage in her smallest finger than half the peerage possesses in its collective spine. If you let her go because society finds the arrangement inconvenient, Charles, I shall consider you a greater fool than I currently believe you to be, and I currently believe you to be a very great fool indeed, for having waited 14 months to go looking for the truth. What would you have me do?" Lady Cassandra fixed him with a look that had, over the decades, cowed dukes considerably more senior than her nephew. "I would have you stop asking me and start doing whatever it is you have already decided, in that stubborn Pendleton heart of yours, that you mean to do regardless of what anyone advises. You did not bring that woman 4 days south in the dead of winter, install her in the best rooms in this house, and summon me here under a veil of the utmost delicacy because you intended to be sensible about any of this. Own it, Charles. Stop hiding behind my counsel." Charles found, to his own faint surprise, that his aunt was entirely correct. He found Harley an hour later in the small conservatory at the rear of the house, a glass-walled room his mother had once filled with orange trees, and which now, in Charles's long neglect, held mostly ferns and a single stubborn lemon tree that refused to die, despite receiving considerably less attention than it deserved. Harley stood before the lemon tree with Edmund asleep against her shoulder, her free hand tracing the edge of a leaf, and she turned at the sound of his footsteps, with an expression that told him she had already guessed what conversation was coming, and had spent the better part of the hour preparing her resistance to it. "Your aunt has been talking to you," she said. "My aunt," Charles said, "has informed me that you intend to disappear again, rather than permit me to claim you publicly, on the theory that my ruin would somehow constitute a kindness to me." "It would be a kindness," Harley said, though her voice wavered on the word. "Charles, you are the Duke of Westford. You sit in committees that decide the fate of trade policy and enclosure bills. You have influence I cannot begin to calculate the value of. Influence that does real good for real people who have never met you and never will. If you attach yourself publicly to a woman with my history, if you raise Radnor's son as your own before the eyes of every drawing room in London, you will hand your political enemies a weapon they will use against you for the rest of your career. Every vote you cast, every bill you champion, will be weighed against the scandal of your household rather than the merit of your argument. I will not be the reason good policy fails, because good men will not listen to a duke they consider compromised." "You have thought a great deal about the mechanics of parliamentary influence," Charles observed, "for a woman who claims she wishes only to protect me." "I have had 18 months with very little else to occupy my mind beyond thinking," Harley said, with an edge of something between grief and dark humor. "One develops certain habits." Charles crossed the conservatory to stand before her, close enough that Edmund, stirring slightly in his sleep, made a small sound between them that neither adult acknowledged aloud. "Let me tell you what I have decided," he said, "having spent this last hour thinking a great deal myself, though rather less usefully than you, I fear. I have decided that I did not survive 14 months of believing you had abandoned me by choice, only to now abandon you by choice myself, out of some misguided theory that my political capital matters more than your safety, your dignity, or your son's future. I have decided that a peerage which cannot survive the truth of what you endured to save my life is not a peerage worth preserving in its present form. And I have decided," he said, more quietly now, "that I love you. Not the memory of you I carried through 14 months of grief, though I loved that too, in my fashion, even through the anger. I love the woman standing in front of me now, who survived what you survived and came out the other side of it, still capable of tenderness, still capable of protecting a child who is not even your own by blood, but has become entirely your own by every measure that matters. I do not want to protect my reputation at the cost of losing you a second time. I would rather lose the whole of society's good opinion and keep you. Charles, marry me," he said. "Not out of pity, not out of some sense of obligation to correct 14 months of misunderstanding, but because I asked you once in a rose garden and meant every word of it, and I am asking you again now, in a conservatory with a dying lemon tree and your son asleep against your shoulder. And I mean these words even more than I meant the first ones, because now I know precisely what they will cost us both, and I am asking anyway." Harley was silent for a long moment, tears standing unshed in her eyes, and Charles waited, having learned, in 14 months and then in these last weeks, the considerable value of patience. "If we do this," she finally said, "we do it with our eyes fully open. Radnor may still come looking for me. Society may never fully accept Edmund, whatever we say or do. Your political enemies will use every weapon my history gives them. I need you to understand that before you answer, Charles, truly understand it, not merely accept it in the abstract comfort of this conservatory." "I understand it," Charles said. "I have spent considerable time this past fortnight instructing my solicitor on precisely how to neutralize the threat Radnor poses, legally and otherwise. I understand that society will gossip, and I find, rather to my own surprise, that I no longer care what is said in drawing rooms I have no wish to enter. I understand that raising Edmund will require a defense of my choices I will need to mount again and again, for years, perhaps for the whole of his childhood. I am prepared for all of it, Harley. I have never been more prepared for anything in my life." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, finally, something in her face broke open, not into tears, though tears came too, but into a kind of relief so total it seemed to unmake, all at once, 18 months of careful, exhausted vigilance. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Charles, I will marry you. I am done running from what I want. In order to spare you a cost, you have already decided you are willing to pay." Edmund, as though sensing the shift in the room, chose that moment to wake fully and begin to fuss, and Charles, laughing, actually laughing, for what felt like the first time in 14 months, reached out and took the child from Harley's arms with the slightly alarmed carefulness of a man who has held very few infants in his life and intends to become considerably more practiced at it. "Welcome to the family, Edmund Pendleton," he said, and the boy, entirely unimpressed by the significance of the moment, hiccuped and grasped a fistful of the Duke's cravat, and Harley, watching them both, laughed through her tears in a way that felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, entirely and simply happy. The matter of Radnor did not resolve itself so simply as the matter of the heart, and Charles, whatever tenderness he had discovered in the conservatory, had not for a moment forgotten the very real danger the man still represented. His solicitor's investigations, pursued with the considerable resources a duke could command, uncovered within 3 weeks a portrait of Radnor's affairs considerably more extensive and more criminal than mere predatory money-lending, a network of forged notes, coerced debts, and at least 2 other women held in circumstances distressingly similar to Harley's own, one of whom, once located and reassured of her safety, proved willing to testify to Radnor's methods before a magistrate. Charles used every particle of his influence to see the matter prosecuted properly rather than quietly buried, a choice that cost him, precisely as Harley had feared, a measure of political capital among certain circles who preferred such unsavory business handled with discretion rather than public trial. But it also earned him, rather to his surprise, the quiet respect of a number of colleagues in Parliament who had grown weary of watching men of Radnor's stripe operate with impunity against families too ashamed or too frightened to seek justice. Radnor himself was apprehended in February, attempting to flee to the continent with a considerable sum in forged notes, and stood trial in the spring assizes on charges of extortion, forgery, and unlawful confinement. Harley, though the ordeal of testifying cost her a sleepless week beforehand, gave her account before the court with a composure that left even the most skeptical observers in no doubt of her character, and Radnor was convicted and sentenced to transportation, removing, at last and permanently, the shadow that had hung over her for 18 months. "It is finished," Charles told her the evening the verdict came down, finding her in the nursery watching Edmund sleep with an expression of profound and exhausted relief. "He can never touch you again. Never touch Edmund. It is entirely, finally finished." "I did not think I would live to hear those words and believe them," Harley said quietly. "For a long time, I believed I would spend the whole of my life looking over my shoulder." "You will not have to look over your shoulder again," Charles said, drawing her against him. "Not while I am living, and I intend to live a very long time yet, largely out of spite for how thoroughly Radnor once believed he could control both our futures." Society, as both Charles and Harley had anticipated, did not receive the news of their engagement with universal grace. The wedding, held quietly in June at Marlow Park's small estate chapel, rather than the grand London affair that might once have been expected of a duke, drew a scattering of pointed refusals from families who considered the match beneath the dignity of the title, and a rather more vocal round of gossip in the fashionable papers, several of which ran unflattering speculation about Edmund's parentage that Charles's solicitors spent a satisfying quantity of legal correspondence correcting. But society, Charles discovered, was rather less monolithic than its harshest voices suggested. Lady Cassandra, whose opinion carried considerable weight among the older and more established families, made her support for the match known with the particular ferocity of a woman defending her own. And several of Charles's genuine friends in Parliament, men who had watched him conduct himself with integrity through the whole of the Radnor prosecution, proved rather more inclined to judge Harley by the courage she had shown in surviving her ordeal than by the circumstances of Edmund's birth. The Duchess of Kelwick, a formidable society hostess whose good opinion Charles had once considered essential to his standing, called upon Harley directly within a month of the wedding, ostensibly to offer congratulations, but transparently to form her own judgment of the new Duchess in person. She left an hour later, having been thoroughly charmed by Harley's wit and disarmed by her evident devotion to both husband and son, and pronounced to anyone who would listen in the weeks that followed that the new Duchess of Westford was, in her considered opinion, one of the more interesting women to enter society in a decade, whatever the unfortunate business of her son's parentage might suggest to lesser minds. It was not universal acceptance. Some doors remained closed to them, some invitations never came, and Harley bore each small slight with a dignity that only occasionally, in the privacy of their own rooms, cracked into the old fear that she had, after all, cost Charles more than he ought to have paid. But Charles, each time, held her through the doubt, and reminded her, with the patience of a man who had learned the hard way what real cost looked like, that he had weighed the exchange with open eyes and found it, every single time, entirely worth the making. "I would rather have you and half of society's disapproval," he told her, on an evening in late autumn as they sat together in the same conservatory where he had proposed, Edmund, now a sturdy, laughing child of nearly a year old, chasing a moth's shadow across the flagstones with the single-minded determination of the very young, than the whole of its approval and an empty house. "You say that now," Harley said, though she was smiling. "I will say it in 20 years, Charles said, "and I will mean it rather more, because by then I expect I shall have entirely forgotten what half of society's good opinion was even worth in the first place." It was the Duchess of Kelwick's autumn ball, some months after her private visit to Marlow Park, that gave Harley her first true test before the full assembled weight of the ton, and Charles, watching his wife descend the great staircase of Kelwick House in a gown of deep blue silk that had been his aunt's particular insistence, found himself unexpectedly nervous on her behalf in a way he had not been since the war. "You need not do this," he murmured, as they waited in the receiving line, "if it is more than you wish to bear tonight. I have survived a money-lender's household and a snowstorm on the open moor," Harley said, though her gloved hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his arm. "I believe I can survive a ballroom, Charles, whatever its inhabitants may choose to say behind their fans." She was tested within the first half-hour. Lady Fenwick, a woman whose tongue was reputed sharper than her considerable jewels, made a point of remarking, just loudly enough to be overheard, that it was remarkable what a duke's fortune could purchase in the way of forgiveness for a woman's past indiscretions. The room around them went very quiet, the particular hush of a society waiting to see how a wound would be received before deciding how to treat it themselves. Harley did not flinch. She turned to Lady Fenwick with the same composed dignity Charles remembered from a wedding breakfast 8 years past, when she had argued Mrs. Wollstonecraft's merits without a trace of self-consciousness, and said, quite clearly, "I have found, Lady Fenwick, that indiscretion is rather more often committed by those who threaten murder to enforce their will than by those who sacrifice everything they have to prevent it. I am glad to say I have only ever been guilty of the latter. I hope you will forgive me if I decline to apologize for surviving." The silence that followed lasted only a moment before the Dowager Marchioness of Alders, an ancient and formidable widow, whose good opinion very few in the room would dare openly contest, began, quite deliberately, to applaud, 2 slow claps that carried across the sudden quiet like a verdict handed down from the bench. A ripple of uncertain laughter followed, and then, remarkably, a scattering of genuine approval, and Lady Fenwick, outmaneuvered and exposed for her own cruelty, rather than Harley's supposed shame, retreated toward the card-room with considerably less dignity than she had arrived with. "I believe," Charles murmured, guiding his wife toward the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a cotillion, "that you have just won yourself rather more of society than either of us anticipated." "I have won myself the Dowager Marchioness's regard," Harley corrected, though she was smiling now, some of the evening's earlier tension visibly draining from her shoulders. "Which I understand, from your aunt, is worth considerably more than the regard of the entire remainder of the room combined." "It generally is," Charles agreed, and drew her into the dance, and if his hand rested rather more possessively at her waist than strict etiquette prescribed, no one in the room that evening was foolish enough to remark upon it. It was the following winter, on the anniversary of the night Charles had found her in the snow, that Harley took the old military greatcoat from the trunk where she had kept it, cleaned and mended, ever since their marriage, and brought it to where Charles sat reading in the library, Edmund asleep upstairs, in the nursery he had come to think of, entirely without qualification, as his son's. "I have been thinking," she said, laying the coat across his knees, "that this ought to belong to Edmund one day, not as a relic of what it cost us to find each other, but as a reminder of what it saved. I should like him to know, when he is old enough to understand it, that this coat kept him alive on the worst night either of us has known, and that the man who gave it to me all those years ago never once, in all the time since, made me feel that I owed him anything for it beyond the truth." Charles ran his hand over the worn wool, remembering a rose garden, a proposal, a wedding that never was, a road buried in snow, and a woman who had walked through 18 months of captivity rather than let harm come to him. "He shall have it," Charles said, "when he is old enough to carry its weight properly. And I hope when that day comes he understands that it was never truly the coat that saved either of you. It was his mother's courage. The coat was only ever the shape that courage happened to take, on one particular night, in one particular snowstorm." Outside the library windows, snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, nothing like the vicious storm of the year before, settling gently over the gardens and the bare trees and the whole quiet expanse of Marlow Park. The fire in the grate threw long amber light across the worn spines of books that had watched over 3 generations of Pendletons, and somewhere above them, in the nursery, Edmund slept in the particular boneless peace of a child who has never once, in all the nights of his short life since that first terrible winter, gone to bed cold or hungry or afraid. Harley came to sit beside her husband, drawing the old coat around both their shoulders as she had once drawn it around herself and her son, and together they watched the snow fall, no longer strangers to winter's cruelty, but no longer afraid of it either, having discovered, in the worst night either of them had ever known, the precise shape and weight of what real love was willing to survive. "I used to think," Harley said quietly, her head resting against his shoulder, "that survival and happiness were entirely separate things, that one endured the first in hope of someday, perhaps, arriving at the second, but that they could never occupy the same hour. I do not think that any longer." "Nor do I," Charles said, drawing her closer against the old, familiar weight of the coat. "I think, perhaps, that the two were never as separate as either of us believed. I think you survived because some part of you already understood what happiness was worth fighting to keep. I have simply had the very great fortune of being permitted to fight alongside you, rather than watch from a distance while you fought alone." Beyond the glass, the snow went on falling, patient and unhurried, covering the gardens in a soft white hush that held no menace in it at all, only the quiet, ordinary business of a season turning, as seasons do, toward whatever came next. And in the library at Marlow Park, in the warm circle of firelight, a duke and his duchess sat together beneath an old soldier's coat, entirely unafraid of the winter, and entirely certain, for the first time in either of their lives, that whatever came next, they would not be made to face it alone.